Hi, I'm Sarah from Woven Rose Needlecraft, and this is part 3 of the Woven Rose Guide to Cross Stitch, where today we are going to be discussing all things fabric. So in the last part of the series, we were discussing charts, and hopefully by now you've had a chance to look at a few designs, and maybe even you have selected the chart which you're going to work from and the design which you're going to stitch, in which case that is fantastic. Well done. But of course now you're left with the next job, and that is to gather up the materials you're going to need to stitch your chosen design. So how do you find out what materials you need? Well, if you have the physical chart, it's really easy because your materials list will be printed on the chart. If, however, you have yet to buy your chart and you want to buy your chart and all of your materials on the same day, if you're going to a physical bricks and mortar shop, or if you want to buy them online and you want to get them all in the same order, how are you going to find out what you need? Well, it's actually quite simple. If you're buying a PDF chart, then you can usually buy those direct from the designer, and they will pretty much always have the materials list listed underneath the name of the chart, or there'll be a document that you can download for free and have a look at the materials list. If you're buying a paper chart, it's a little bit more difficult. In that case, you're going to have to go to the retailer and see if they have the materials list available. If it's a bricks and mortar shop, they'll probably be able to do something for you, or they'll have the materials listed, or they might even be able to take the chart out of the package and show you. They're very, very helpful. If it is an online retailer, then often they will actually have the materials listed on the same page as the chart. So often if you click onto the chart and scroll down, you will see all the materials listed, and some of them even have a function whereby you can just click buy all and it'll add all the materials in the correct quantity to your cart, which is fantastic. However, not every retailer is able to offer that service, of course. And what do you do if they don't have the materials listed? Well, you can just simply Google it. And usually if you Google the name of your chart and the designer and then materials list, you will come across either someone else who has worked on that chart and has uploaded the list, or you will find the designer's own website and they will have the materials listed, or often there is a social media account or a Facebook page dedicated to that designer and they will be able to help you. Material lists are not copyrighted, so there's no issue with sharing the list of materials that you're going to need. That's absolutely fine. And hopefully you will be able to find your list, no problem. So in the last part of the series, I told you that I was going to be stitching a sample piece throughout the series, and that my chosen sample piece was called Angel of Christmas, and it was a chart by Lavender and Lace. And in this case, it's a paper chart. So I need to find out what materials I'm going to need for my Angel of Christmas chart. And as this is a paper chart, it's printed on the actual chart itself in the corner. So if I look here, I see all of this information for my materials list. And really all I'm interested in at the moment is the fabric. And the fabric information is found on the first 2 lines. Now we're going to ignore the second line just for the moment, we'll come to that, and we're only going to look at the first line. And the first line says, stitched on 32 count, raw linen, in brackets 2/2 from Zweigart. That's not very many words, but it carries a lot of information. So let's break down what that actually means. So 32 count, that refers to the fabric count. Fabric count dictates how big each stitch will be, and therefore how big the full finished piece will be. Next we have the word raw. Now raw in this case is referring to the colour of the fabric. So on your chart, it might say spruce blue or willow green or powder pink or whatever. But in this case, it's raw, and it simply just means undyed linen. So in this particular case, they are suggesting to use a raw or an undyed linen. The next word then is linen, and linen refers to the type of fabric. So usually with cross stitch, we're talking about one of three fabric types. Those three types are Aida, Evenweave, and linen. Next, it says 2/2 in brackets. Now, what on earth does that mean? 2/2 refers to how many threads. So how many strands of cotton, actual sewing thread, we're going to be using, and how many threads of fabric we're going to be stitching over. That sounds very complicated. It is. Don't worry, we're going to come back to all of this and talk about it in a little bit of detail. Lastly, we see the word Zweigart. Zweigart sounds a bit German, and it is German. It's a German brand of Needlecraft fabric. So all they're talking about there is the brand, and again, we will talk a little bit about brand in just a moment. But for now, let's start breaking down what these terms mean. And I think really, in order to make things as simple as we can, we should start by talking about fabric type. So beside me here, I have a few examples of some commonly used needlecraft fabric. Although there are technically quite a few different types of fabric which could be classed as needlecraft fabric, usually we are using one of three types of fabric. And those three types are Aida, Evenweave, and linen. So the first type of fabric I would like to talk about is Aida. Now, Aida is the type of fabric most commonly used by beginner stitchers, and there's a few different reasons for that. It's probably the most affordable of the needlecraft fabrics. You might argue it's the most readily available, and also it is probably the easiest fabric to use. Now, why is that? If we look at Aida, it has quite a unique structure. Aida is made up of all of these little blocks. And when you're stitching across a block. So your cross stitch or your X will cover one block. And when you're stitching on Aida, you can almost feel where your needle needs to go because the needle doesn't want to pierce those blocks. It wants to cross over the block, almost jump over the Aida block. So you'll sometimes find with Aida that you don't need to look as closely as you might with another type of needlecraft fabric. Aida is the fabric most often found in kits as well. So if you're starting your cross-stitch journey with a kit, 9 times out of 10 you'll find that it has Aida in it. And like I said, it's a really great fabric to start with, and I think it probably is a little bit easier for a beginner. So what are the pros of Aida? Well, the first pro is that it is, like I said, more affordable. The second is that it's more readily available. The third is that it is a little bit easier for a beginner to work on Aida. The fourth is that if you are struggling a little bit with your eyesight, it's usually easier to stitch on Aida because you don't have to look quite as close. The blocks are quite distinct, and it's often easier to see where your needle needs to go next. And like I said, because of the structure of Aida, you can actually nearly feel with the tip of the needle where it wants to go. So it's really great if your eyesight is not what it once was. Another great thing about Aida is that because of this unique block structure, it's very structurally sound. And what that means is that if you're stitching with half stitches, which we'll talk about later, or if your tension is a little bit off, it's less likely to warp. There have been cases where people are stitching on Evenweave or linen, and over time their entire design has gone a little bit skewed because their fabric has actually warped or sort of bent out of shape. It sounds like it would never happen, but you would be surprised about how common that is. So with Aida, it's less likely to happen because of just how solid Aida is. So are there any cons to Aida? Well, yes, of course, there are a few. The first is that it can be a little bit stiff when it's brand new, and that can take a little bit of time to work out. The second con is that some people would say it's not the prettiest to look at, and this is particularly important if you're stitching a design that doesn't have a stitched background. So when it's all finished and framed, you're actually going to be able to see the fabric. Some people would argue that Aida doesn't look as well as your Evenweave or your linen. Another con is that you can't stitch small stitches on it. So what I mean by that is petite point stitches, quarter stitches, 1/1 stitches, the tiny little stitches that we're going to talk about later on in the series, which are not that common, but you might need to put one here or there. They are a lot more difficult on Aida, and they actually require you to pierce the Aida block. That's quite difficult to do, and it's also quite difficult to do that consistently. So what you can sometimes find happening with Aida is if you're trying to do a lot of these little quarter stitches, they can kind of turn out to be slightly different sizes from one another, because it's very difficult to make it precise when you're trying to force the tip of your needle through the Aida block, which it doesn't want to go through. The next type of fabric I'd like to talk to you about is Evenweave. Now, Evenweave is a little bit of a blanket term. There's no exact definition, I don't think, of what Evenweave fabric is, but it's generally agreed that Evenweave is fabric where the warp and the weft thread, so the vertical and horizontal threads, are the same thickness and the same distance apart. The Evenweave that we use in cross stitch is generally a cotton viscose mix, and this means that it's very durable, it's usually very soft, and it's a really lovely fabric to work on. Evenweave is a little bit more difficult to work on than Aida because you don't have those blocks to guide you. And with Evenweave, we're usually working over 2 strands of thread, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But because of that, it can be a little bit more difficult to find exactly where to place your needle, and that can take a little bit of getting used to. So what are the pros of Evenweave? Well, like I said, it's very soft. It looks very nice. So if you're stitching a project that doesn't have a stitched background and your fabric is going to be visible, Evenweave looks really, really good. It's a perfect middle ground between Aida and linen. And when I get to speak about linen, you'll probably see what I mean by that. It is more affordable than linen, but like linen, because of its structure, it's ideal for projects with those petite point stitches, quarter stitches, the small stitches. If you're stitching 1/1, don't worry about what that means, we'll get to that. Evenweave is ideal. I would say that the cons of Evenweave are that it is a little bit less easy to stitch on than Aida, takes a little bit of getting used to, and if your eyesight is not 100%, let's say, it can be very difficult, even with glasses, to find the correct hole. They're really, really small. Another con is that it's not as authentic looking as linen. A lot of stitchers want that really original look that linen has that would have been used by stitchers years ago. And the third con may be surprising. It certainly is to me, because I always consider Evenweave to be the Goldilocks porridge of cross-stitch fabric or Needlecraft fabric. It's sort of in the middle of Aida and linen. But actually, you may find that it's not always as readily available as either Aida or linen. I think a lot of people tend to go from Aida straight on to linen and maybe forget about Evenweave. But I have to say, Evenweave is one of my favorite fabrics. I really, really think it looks beautiful. It's so well behaved. It's so easy to stitch on compared to linen. And it's more affordable because instead of being linen, it's, like I said, usually a cotton and viscose mix, or sometimes 100% cotton. If you can see this sampler behind me, this autumn sampler, it was stitched on Evenweave, and I absolutely love the way that it looks. I think it's fair to say that I have saved the best until last, because the last fabric we have to talk about is, of course, linen. And a lot of stitchers would consider linen the only fabric to stitch on. Linen has a very long history. When in the last part of the series I was talking about the stitchers centuries ago stitching those little samplers, most of those samplers were being stitched on linen fabric. Linen is not quite as straightforward to stitch on as Evenweave or especially Aida. It can be a little bit temperamental. You may find that the threads in a piece of linen fabric are of unequal thickness. So you might get a very, very thin little thread and then a wider piece of thread that almost looks like a piece of straw. But that is just the nature of the fabric. And I think the beauty of the fabric is quite rustic in appearance. I think when you're talking about the pros of linen, you really have to start with the appearance. It is an absolutely beautiful fabric to look at. It's so rustic and tactile and gorgeous. And if you're stitching a piece like our sample piece that is missing a lot of its background and your fabric is going to be really visible, I don't think anything looks as beautiful as linen. Another pro of linen is, of course, its heritage. Like I said, this is what stitchers were stitching on centuries ago, and it's really lovely as stitchers in the 21st century to be continuing on with that tradition and using such a gorgeous fabric. It's also, of course, a completely natural fabric. Linen is made from flax, which grows out in the fields, so it's a very, very natural fabric. And if that's something that you're concerned about, which is completely understandable, and I would feel that way, you can rest assured knowing that you have probably one of the most natural fabrics you can get your hands on. Another pro of linen is that due to its popularity, it is usually available in a wide variety of shades, including some undyed or natural shades, which are absolutely gorgeous. You can also sometimes get opalescent linen, so linen with a metallic thread running through it, and that can be absolutely gorgeous on Christmas pieces or celebratory pieces. It's absolutely lovely sometimes to use an opalescent fabric. In terms of the drawbacks of linen, well, we have to talk about the price. It is more expensive than both Aida and Evenweave. Is it worth it? I would probably argue yes, but you always have to work within your own budget and your project won't really lose anything for you choosing a cheaper or a more affordable fabric. Linen is that little bit more expensive, but it is absolutely gorgeous. And I do think if you have the budget and if you're comfortable spending maybe €5 more on your piece of fabric or a little bit more, then go for the linen. Another con is that it can be a little bit more difficult to work on, obviously more difficult than Aida, but even more difficult than Evenweave because, like I said, those threads are not always even, and sometimes you have to kind of get your needle in and separate the threads that can become a little bit stuck together. You can also get slubs, which are sort of lumps in the fabric. It's just part of the charm, I think. The last negative point about linen, and this applies to all fabric, but I do think linen is particularly prone to it, and that is fraying. Now I am going to talk about fabric fraying later on in this video because it really is something you need to think about. But in my experience, linen is the absolute worst fabric for fraying, and the fraying will start from day one. So I am going to talk a little bit later about how to prevent fraying, and I think if you're stitching on linen, you really need to be on the ball with that and take precautionary measures as quickly as you can to avoid irreparable damage to your piece of fabric. The next thing we're going to look at is fabric count. So our sample piece, Angel of Christmas, is asking us to use 32 count fabric. What does that mean? Well, it means that there are 32 holes per inch of fabric. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to show you now. So in front of me here, I have a piece of Aida, which I think is 14 count, and I'm just going to double check. So how I check is I put down my measuring tape and I'm going to count how many holes there are in 1 inch of the fabric. So from here to here is an inch. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. That hole then is part of the next inch. So 14 holes per inch. So this is a piece of 14 count Aida. So I've just stitched a row of stitches onto my 14 count Aida. And then here we have a piece of 18 count Aida. Now this is obviously gridded, but that doesn't matter. So 18 count, 18 holes per inch, 14 count, 14 holes per inch. And I hope you can see that the stitches on the 14 count Aida are significantly larger than the stitches on the 18 count Aida. So fabric count really does make quite a significant difference in terms of the size of your stitches and therefore in terms of the size of your finished piece. So now that you hopefully understand a little bit about what fabric count means, the next question to ask is, why does it matter, or does it even matter? It depends. Sometimes the designers have chosen that particular count of fabric for a very specific reason. Perhaps they're using something like beads, where the fabric count really matters because the beads are obviously a certain size and you need to calculate how many beads you need to fill a space. You don't want your beads all crammed on top of each other, but likewise you don't want your beads spaced too far apart if they're supposed to be quite close together. So if I decided to stitch my Angel of Christmas on 28 count fabric instead of 32 count fabric, so 28 holes per inch, each hole is a tiny bit farther apart, my thread has a tiny bit further to go, therefore my stitches are bigger, therefore my finished piece is bigger, but also my beads are a tiny bit further apart. I would need to bear that in mind. Now usually with 32 count, going to 28 count is manageable. Going to 36 count, which would make a smaller finished piece, 36 holes per inch, could be manageable, but I wouldn't stray too far outside those parameters. So generally, with complicated pieces like the lavender lace especially, it is often best just to stick with the fabric count. But some people find 32 count just too difficult. The holes are just too close together. And then once you go up to 36 count and 40 count and beyond, it's absolutely tiny, and you need to have brilliant eyesight, and you also need to have very good patience because you're doing these teeny tiny little stitches. So if we think back to our fabric specification on our chart, it said that we're stitching 2 over 2. Now what does that mean? This is something that often can confuse new stitchers especially. So the first number, the first 2, is referring to the strands of thread that we're going to be using. So we're going to be using 2 strands of cotton thread. We'll be talking about thread in the next video. That's quite simple. We're stitching with 2 strands of thread, very standard, no problem. The second 2, so 2 over 2, the second number refers to how many threads of the fabric we'll be stitching over. And this is where a lot of people can find themselves getting a little bit lost. So if we look at our Aida, we will notice that it has 1 block, and we are stitching over 1 block. So we're stitching over 1 because that block counts as a thread. Aida is always stitched over 1. I've never seen Aida being stitched over anything other than 1. With Evenweave and with linen, we are stitching over 2 threads. So we're always moving diagonally from corner to corner, but rather than jumping over 1 thread, we're actually going to be jumping over 2 threads. So stitching over 2, and that's going to make our stitch. So over 2. If we were stitching petite point stitches, quarter stitches, we will be stitching over 1. So in our chart, our angel's face will be stitched over 1. Now, that may be confusing. Don't worry, we are going to have a little bit of a closer look at that now. When it comes to linen and Evenweave, we are usually, not always, but usually stitching over 2. So what does that mean? So here we have our stitches on our piece of Evenweave, and our stitches are jumping over 1 thread and jumping over 2 threads to make our leg of each leg of the stitch. So over 1 and over 2. So we stitch Evenweave and linen most of the time over 2. So here we have our piece of 28 count Evenweave, and here we have our piece of 14 count Aida, and you might notice that these stitches look quite similar in size. They're actually the exact same size. I've just had my measuring tape out just to double check that they are the same size. And of course the reason that they're the same size is because on our linen and our Evenweave we're working over 2 threads and we're working into every second hole. So in reality, per inch of our Evenweave, there really is only 14 holes per inch being used. So that's why the stitches on our 28 count Evenweave, when we work over 2, are the same size as on our 14 count Aida. So what this means is that if you have a chart for 14 count Aida and you would prefer to use 28 count Evenweave, it will work out the same size. Likewise with 16 count Aida and 32 count Evenweave, 18 count Aida, 36 count Evenweave, so on and so forth. Can you do it in reverse? To an extent, if you have a piece that's charted for 28 count Evenweave and you would prefer to stitch it on 14 count Aida, it will work as long as you're using full stitches, full crosses over 2. If you're getting into 1/1 stitching or quarter stitches, petite point stitches, it becomes a little bit more complicated because then you'd have to be piercing the Aida blocks, and that's not really something you want to be doing. So here I have a piece of 32 count linen, and I've just put in a few rows of stitches here. So these stitches are over 2, and they're kind of quite average sized stitches. And then next to it here, I don't know if you can see, we have some absolutely teeny tiny little stitches, and they're so small that I've actually only done 1 leg of the stitch because it would have been too bulky to use both legs. And these stitches are made over 1 thread. So there's actually the same amount of stitches, 2 rows, 5 across on both samples, but these little tiny stitches are made over 1 thread. So jumping from 1 hole over the thread into the next hole. So that's over 1 stitching. And then these larger stitches are made over 2. So that's the difference between stitching over 2 and stitching over 1. So now that we have those heavier topics out of the way, it's time to talk about something a little bit more fun, and that is colour. So most designers will specify the colour fabric which they think you should stitch your piece on. Does that mean that you have to do what they tell you? No, of course not. You can stitch it on whatever colour you want. But I would bear in mind that the designer has chosen that colour for a specific reason. And often it may be because there are parts of the design that they want to blend into the background, or there are parts of the design they want to stand in contrast to the background. So my angel is blue, and the designer has suggested stitching on this quite neutral colour, and I think that's so the blue will really stand out against that colour. So therefore, I won't stray too far from that suggested colour. In fact, I am going to stitch the angel on the suggested fabric, which is raw linen. But if I was going to stitch on a different type of fabric, I might go from a mushroomy colour or a cream colour, but I wouldn't stray too far from the suggested colour of raw linen. Often stitchers will like to be very creative with their colours and will stitch on a hand-dyed fabric. Now, hand-dyed fabrics are usually bought from quite small independent companies, independent dyers, people who are incredibly creative and who are taking these standard Aida, Evenweave and linen fabrics and then over dyeing them in an array of amazing colours, amazing designs, speckles and tie-dye effect. It's really, really wonderful. And hand-dyed fabrics are particularly popular with people stitching chatelaines and people stitching fancy ladies, so your lavender and lace, your Bella Filipina and your Mirabilia. It's really important if you're planning on using over-dyed fabric to bear one thing in mind, and that is colour fastness. So because of the saturation of the dye and the types of dyes used in the over-dyeing process, the dyer cannot always guarantee that the piece will remain colour fast. So basically, if you wash the piece of fabric, it may run. Now, that's completely understandable. Like I said, the intensity of these dyes and the sheer amount of dyes that go into this piece, sometimes it's just not possible to make them completely colour fast. Now, for a lot of people, that doesn't matter because they just stitch their piece onto the fabric and then Bob's your uncle, it's finished. Other people, and I am one of these people, like to wash their piece when it's finished. And on a hand-dyed fabric, that's not always possible. Because what could end up happening is when you submerge your piece into the water, the dyes in the fabric could start running and they could run into your stitching, and that would be an absolute nightmare. So if you have a look at some of these hand-dyed fabrics, and I would 100% recommend you do, because they're absolutely spectacular, have a look and see if they're colour fast. And if you think that you're happy enough stitching your piece and not washing it, which a lot of people are, then go ahead, fantastic. And if you're like me and you think you're going to want to stitch your finished piece before framing it, then really just double check that that fabric is colour fast. One other thing to remember about hand-dyed fabric is sometimes the count of the fabric can be a little bit altered. Sometimes the saturation of the dyes and the amount of dyes used actually can cause the fabric to shrink a little bit. Now, dyers are absolutely fantastic and they will tell you all of this in the description, but just double check that your fabric count hasn't been slightly altered in the dyeing process. And if it has, just have a think and see if it's really going to matter. And if it is, maybe you just need to alter what fabric you're ordering so that your piece will end up being the same size as it would have if you were stitching on a standard piece of fabric. The last thing on our list was the brand of fabric. In this case, our chart is asking us to stitch on Zweigart fabric. Do I have to stitch on Zweigart fabric? No, absolutely not. I will say that I like to stitch on Zweigart because I find it to be very good quality. It's the fabric I've always stitched on. And when I've veered away from Zweigart and gone for a different brand, often I have found the quality not to be quite as good. That's not saying that there is no fabric out there that's as good as Zweigart. Absolutely not. It's just been my experience that sometimes the cheaper brands don't always match the quality that I'm used to. I find this especially with Aida. Sometimes the cheaper Aidas can be very, very stiff, and all Aida is stiff when you first buy it, but they can be so stiff and then they don't really soften up. So there are some very reputable brands of Needlecraft fabric out there. Have a look. Like I said, Zweigart is my favourite, but by no means is it the only brand to choose from. So do a bit of research, see what's available in your area. If you're buying from a local shop, see what they have and then go from there. So now that you've decided the type of fabric you're going to stitch on, the count, the colour and the brand, the last thing you need to think about is how big the piece of fabric needs to be. Of course, you don't want it so small that you're not able to fit your whole design on it, but you also don't want it to be enormous, and you don't want to waste your money buying a piece of fabric that's far bigger than you need, and most of which will end up going to waste. In order to calculate the size of fabric you're going to need, you need first to get your stitch count. So where do you find your stitch count? On your chart. And of course, if you don't have your chart, you will often find the stitch count listed on the chart listing if you're buying it online, or if you're in a physical Needlecraft shop, they'll be able to help you with that. The stitch count of our Angel of Christmas piece is 210 by 261. So that means there are 210 stitches from the widest point to the widest point horizontally, and there are 261 stitches from the very, very top to the very, very bottom. Now, why does that matter? Because that's going to help us calculate the size of our fabric. Now, if you want to get out your calculator and do your calculations by hand, you absolutely can. But for me, I prefer to go onto a wonderful website called yarntree.com and find their calculator. And into that calculator, you can put all the details of your project. So what size fabric you're going to be stitching on, what the stitch count is, whether you're stitching over 1 or over 2. And like I said, for Aida, it'll be over 1. And for linen or Evenweave, it'll probably be over 2. And then a few other details like how many inches you want around your border. So those are the inches that are going to be visible around the edge of your piece. And then how many inches you want for framing. So they're the fabric that's going to be pulled around back and laced. We will get on to framing at the end, but you always need excess fabric for framing and a little bit of excess for a border around your piece. So you put in all your details and it will spit out the size of fabric you need. It's incredibly handy. Most Needlecraft retailers get their fabric in from the manufacturer on big bolts, and usually the fabric is about 5 meters long and then wrapped around these bolts. Obviously, you're not going to be buying 5 meters of fabric, so they are going to cut it for you. Now, what that means is they will usually list on their website, or they'll tell you if it's in store, the sizes that they can cut to. They're not going to cut an exact size that you specify because it would lead to too much waste, but they will give you a few options. And what you do then is you usually find the option that is the next biggest to what you need. So obviously it's better to have too much than too little. So if your chosen size is in the middle, obviously you're going to want to go bigger. Because the Needlecraft fabrics do come on those big bolts and they have been cut by hand, when you get your piece of fabric, it will probably have a raw edge. Now, a raw edge is not a problem as long as you treat it. If you don't treat a raw edge, it can start to pull back over time, it can start to disintegrate, and you can end up with a mess, and you can also end up losing centimeters off your fabric. So how do you secure a raw edge and prevent it from fraying? Well, there are a few ways. My preferred way is to get out the sewing machine and just run a simple zigzag stitch all around the raw edges of my fabric. You will usually have a selvage edge. You don't need to worry about a selvage edge, which is the finished edge, because that is secure. So just the raw edges, I'll go around with my sewing machine and do a simple zigzag stitch around those raw edges, and that will just trap the threads and prevent them from fraying back. If you don't have a sewing machine, don't worry, and please do not go out and buy one. You can just do a running stitch, and that will often work, or you can fold back the edge of your fabric and just sort of tack it down, and often that's enough to hold it, and that's enough to keep the threads from pulling back. Some stitchers like to use masking tape. Some very experienced stitchers like to use masking tape, and what they do is they just fold the tape over the edge of the fabric, and that stops it fraying back. It's not my favorite method because I find that you either have to leave the tape on, or when you pull the tape off, it's sticky and it leaves a residue, and that can discolor over time. But the argument is it doesn't really matter because it's the edge of the fabric and no one's going to be seeing it anyway. And that's quite a fair argument. And like I said, it's a method used by a lot of very experienced stitchers with decades of experience and decades of practice, and they know what they're doing. So do whatever works for you. Personally, I like a zigzag stitch, but like I said, if you don't have a sewing machine, there are lots of other methods that will work probably just as well. Before we say goodbye for this part, I have to just very quickly talk about gridded fabric. So gridded fabric is regular Aida or Evenweave that has these squares marked in the fabric. And what gridded fabric is great for is it helps you count your stitches. So it helps you space out your stitches and figure out where the next stitch should go. And they're usually in these 10 by 10 blocks. So 100 stitches will fit into one of these squares. Why 10 by 10? Because if you look at a cross stitch chart, the chart itself will usually be broken into 10 by 10 blocks. So your fabric is matching your chart. Of course, gridded fabric can be used by any stitcher, but it is most commonly used by full coverage stitchers. It makes stitching full coverage so much easier, and it makes it a lot simpler to keep track of where your stitches are, where you're going, and making sure that you don't misplace a stitch. A misplaced stitch in any project, but of course in full coverage, can throw out the whole rest of your chart, and it can be an absolute nightmare trying to figure out where you put in your wrong stitches and then ripping them all back. It's something that no stitcher wants to encounter. Gridded fabric comes in lots of different counts. My personal favourite gridded fabric is 18 count Aida. This is my sweet spot for stitching full coverage because the stitches are not absolutely tiny, but they're small enough that the finished piece looks really crisp and really, really nice. I am hoping to make a series, it will be shorter than this series, but a mini series if you like on full coverage, maybe early next year, and really show you how I like to stitch full coverage because it's just one of my absolute favourite things. I adore full coverage stitching, and I have to say it's made a lot more enjoyable by using gridded fabric. So that's it for our chat about fabric. A lot of information this week. I totally understand that. Fabric can be a little bit complicated, and I hope I haven't bored anyone or confused anyone. If you have any questions about fabric or about anything, please do leave them down below and I'll try and get back to you. And until next week, thank you for watching and goodbye.